The room was suffocating in its silence. The millionaire's final request had shattered the air like a dying breath. His dog, his only companion, was to be strapped into the electric chair. The warden's hands trembled, the switch humming with death. But then, something unimaginable happened. The rain lashed against the high windows of the estate, each drop a tiny hammer against the fragile silence. Inside the dimly lit study, Leonard Grayson sat hunched over in his leather armchair, fingers curled around a crystal glass of untouched whiskey. The ice had long since melted. The amber liquid shimmered under the light of the dying fire, but Leonard's gaze was fixed elsewhere, on the old photograph resting beneath the dim glow of a brass desk lamp. The edges of the picture were frayed, the once bright image faded with time. In it, a much younger Leonard stood beside a German shepherd, a wide grin on his face, untouched by the years of regret that now carved deep lines into his features. The dog, regal and strong, stared at the camera with the unwavering loyalty that Leonard had long since forgotten. The photograph was the only thing in this house that still held any warmth. Beyond the study, the grand mansion was as hollow as its owner. Once this house had been alive with movement. Guests, business partners, lovers who whispered sweet promises before fading into irrelevance. But those days were gone, and what remained was a mausoleum of excess, echoing with the ghosts of a man who had built his empire atop the bones of his conscience. The wind howled through the gaps in the window panes, but Leonard did not move. He merely stared, as if he could will himself back into that photograph to a time before he had become the man he was now. A man whose last wish had sent whispers through the corridors of power and wealth. His request had not been a joke. The moment it left his lips, the air had turned thick with disbelief. The lawyer had shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearing his throat before daring to ask, "Sir, you're certain?" "Yes," Leonard had said, his voice hollow. "It is my last wish." The dog, Duke, lay at his feet even now, his coat speckled with the white of age, his breathing deep and steady. He had been by Leonard's side through everything, the rise, the fall, the betrayals, the victories that had cost too much. And now, as Leonard neared the end of his own journey, he wanted Duke to follow. There had been murmurs, legal objections, ethical protests, but Leonard Grayson was not a man accustomed to being denied. His wealth could pave roads through hell itself, and this request, as mad as it seemed, would be carried out. The date was set. The electric chair had been arranged. A storm raged outside, but it was nothing compared to the storm within him. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward Duke's head. The dog lifted his gaze, wise and knowing. "You've always trusted me, haven't you?" Leonard whispered, his voice almost breaking. "Even now." Duke's eyes held no fear, just patience, just love, and that, more than anything, made Leonard feel the weight of his own sin. The knock at the door shattered the fragile moment. Leonard closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing himself for the inevitable. The butler, Charles, stepped inside, his face as impassive as ever, though there was something unreadable in his gaze. "Sir, the arrangements have been confirmed," Charles said, his voice carefully neutral. "The governor's office has issued the clearance. Everything will proceed as scheduled." Leonard nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He reached for the whiskey, but his fingers hovered just above the glass before withdrawing. He felt Duke shift at his feet, a quiet presence grounding him in the storm of his own making. "And the press?" Leonard asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Contained," Charles replied. "The outside world knows nothing, as you wished." Leonard exhaled, the weight in his chest pressing down like a stone. He had spent a lifetime controlling narratives, shaping reality to fit his will. But this was different. This was not a deal to be negotiated, not a fortune to be bartered. This was finality. And for the first time in years, Leonard Grayson felt the stirrings of something foreign and unwelcome. Doubt. Charles hesitated, a rare thing for a man so well trained in discretion. "Sir," he said slowly, "may I speak freely?" Leonard looked up, a flicker of surprise passing through his cold gray eyes. He gave the slightest nod. "This request?" Charles chose his words with the precision of a man who knew he was walking a razor's edge. "It is unusual." Leonard let out a short, humorless chuckle. "That's a polite way of putting it." Charles did not smile. "I have served you for many years, sir. I have seen you make ruthless decisions. I have carried out orders without question. But this—" He glanced down at Duke, whose golden eyes watched him with an eerie stillness. "This is different." Leonard's jaw tightened. "Are you questioning me, Charles?" The butler met his gaze with quiet resolve. "I am asking you to question yourself." For a moment, neither man spoke. The fire crackled, sending flickering shadows across the mahogany walls. Outside, the storm raged on, wind rattling against the glass. Then Leonard stood, his movements slow, deliberate. He walked toward the window, placing a hand against the cold glass, looking out over the rain-drenched estate. His reflection stared back at him, a man who had conquered the world but lost himself along the way. Duke's ears perked as if sensing something unspoken, something shifting in the air. Leonard's fingers curled into a fist against the glass. "It's already decided." Charles bowed his head. "Very well, sir." But as he turned to leave, Leonard could feel the unspoken words lingering in the space between them, and for the first time since he had made the request, he wondered if he had made a mistake. The rain had stopped, but the world outside Leonard Grayson's estate still felt drenched in the remnants of the storm. The trees stood motionless, their branches weighed down by glistening beads of water, and the sky stretched in a thick, muted gray. It was the kind of morning that felt too still, too heavy, as if the very air was holding its breath. Leonard sat at the grand dining table, an untouched cup of coffee growing cold before him. The house, vast and empty, swallowed every sound except for the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was strange how silence could be deafening. A rustling movement at his feet made him glance down. Duke lay there, his body curled at Leonard's side, as he always had been. The dog's deep brown eyes lifted to meet his master's, quiet and unshaken, as if he could sense the gravity in the air. Leonard's fingers curled slightly against the surface of the table. His heart clenched, an unfamiliar, unwanted feeling, but he shook it off quickly. He had made his decision. There was no room for regret. Then, from outside, the sound came. Tires on gravel. Leonard didn't move at first. He simply listened as the low hum of an approaching car grew louder, punctuated by the faint spray of rainwater displaced beneath its wheels. The moment had come. Charles, his ever-loyal butler, entered the room without knocking. He paused by the door, his usual composure strained with something unreadable in his expression. "Sir," he said quietly, "they're here." Leonard took in a slow breath and rose from his chair. The weight of his own body felt heavier than usual, but he did not falter. Without a word, he stepped past Charles and strode toward the grand entrance. The long black sedan had stopped at the foot of the marble steps. The doors opened in perfect synchronization, and two men stepped out. They were dressed in dark coats, their movements precise, mechanical, men accustomed to such grim tasks. Leonard met them at the threshold of his estate, his face an unreadable mask. One of the men, a tall figure with sharp, calculating eyes, stepped forward and adjusted the cuffs of his gloves before speaking. "Mr. Grayson," he greeted, his tone professional, yet lacking warmth. "Everything is prepared. We can take him now." Leonard's grip tightened at his side. "Where?" "The facility has been arranged as per your specifications," the man answered. "Everything will be handled cleanly." Cleanly. Leonard turned his head slightly, casting a glance at Duke, who had padded forward to stand beside him. The dog's tail gave a slow, gentle wag, as if unaware of what was unfolding around him, as if he still trusted his master without question. Leonard swallowed. A strange tightness coiled in his chest, but he pushed it down. "Do it," he ordered, his voice cold. The men nodded, stepping forward. Duke did not resist when they reached for him. He allowed himself to be led down the steps, obedient as always. Leonard did not move. did not speak. He merely watched as his companion of 13 years was placed into the back seat of the sedan. The door shut. The engine started. And as the car rolled forward, Leonard stood in the doorway of his mansion, staring after it, his hands clenched into fists. For the first time in decades, something inside him cracked, and deep in his chest, where he had long believed there was nothing left to feel, regret took root. The black sedan disappeared down the winding driveway, swallowed by the mist rolling over the hills. Leonard stood motionless on the marble steps, his breath steady, his expression unchanged. He had always prided himself on his ability to make difficult decisions without hesitation. But this time, something was different. The rain had returned, light at first, a whisper against the stone pathway. Leonard turned away from the empty road and stepped back inside, closing the heavy door behind him. The house was unbearably quiet. Charles was waiting in the foyer, standing stiffly by the grand staircase. His face was unreadable, but Leonard could see it, the unspoken disapproval, the doubt pressing against his years of unwavering loyalty. "You disapprove," Leonard said flatly, brushing droplets of water from his sleeve. Charles hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It is not my place, sir." Leonard exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Don't patronize me, Charles." A rare flicker of something close to frustration crossed the butler's face, but it vanished just as quickly. "May I ask you something, sir?" Leonard turned his gaze to him, eyes dark and expectant. "Go on." Charles squared his shoulders. "Why?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Leonard's jaw clenched. "Because it is my will." Charles studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Very well, sir." He turned and exited the foyer, his footsteps fading into the distance, leaving Leonard alone with the emptiness he had created. For the first time in years, Leonard felt a foreign sensation creeping in, not power, not control, but something colder, something quieter. Loss. That night, the storm raged harder than before. Lightning split the sky in violent streaks, illuminating the estate in sharp, fleeting flashes. The wind howled through the corridors, rattling the windows, shaking the walls as if the house itself protested against its master's choice. Leonard sat in his study, his whiskey untouched, his gaze locked onto the fire burning low in the hearth. His fingers twitched slightly against the arm of his chair. His body was still, but his mind was not. Duke was gone. For the first time in 13 years, the weight of his presence was missing. No soft breathing at his feet, no steady eyes watching him from across the room. The absence was suffocating. Leonard tried to shake it off, but his thoughts would not quiet. His mind drifted, backward unwillingly, to another night long ago. A younger man, filled with ambition and certainty. A loyal companion trotting at his side as he walked through these very halls, the house not yet a tomb but a place of life. He had built everything with his own hands, carved his empire from nothing, and through it all Duke had been there. And now, Duke was walking toward his end, because Leonard had deemed it so. Leonard's fingers curled into a fist. What had he done? The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Leonard was awake. He had not slept, though he had spent the night convincing himself otherwise. The fire had burned out, the study cold with the morning chill. A knock at the door. Leonard barely looked up. "Come in." Charles entered, his usual precision in place, though something about his posture was different. Tense, unreadable. "There's been a complication, sir." Leonard straightened. "What kind of complication?" Charles hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped forward, extending a single envelope. Leonard took it, breaking the wax seal with a swift motion. Inside was a letter, written in tight, careful script. His eyes scanned the page, and the longer he read, the colder he felt. The procedure had not gone as planned. Duke was still alive. Leonard's breath hitched slightly, but he masked it well. "Explain." Charles folded his hands behind his back. "The governor intervened, sir. Someone leaked the information to the press." Leonard's grip on the letter tightened. The backlash was immediate. Charles continued, his voice steady but measured. They halted everything. Duke has been placed in protective care. Leonard's vision darkened for a moment. This was not how things were meant to unfold. His will was law. There were no obstacles, no denials. And yet, the world had turned against him. But beneath his fury, buried deep beneath the years of control, another feeling lurked. Relief. A single, unshakable truth settled in his chest. Duke was still alive. For the first time in decades, Leonard Grayson did not know what to do. Leonard Grayson had spent a lifetime bending the world to his will. Now, for the first time, it refused to yield. He stood in the dim light of his study, the letter trembling slightly in his grip. Duke was alive. The execution had been stopped. His private request, his final demand, had been overturned by forces beyond his reach. For a moment, he was frozen. The storm outside had quieted, but within him, something far more violent churned. They had no right, he murmured, his voice low and dangerous. No one had the right. Charles remained silent, his presence steady but unreadable. He had served Leonard for decades, seen him wield power like a weapon, watched him break men with nothing more than a signature. But this? This was different. Leonard turned sharply, his breath uneven. Who leaked it? Charles's hesitation was almost imperceptible, but Leonard caught it. I do not know, sir. A lie. Or at least, not the full truth. Leonard's jaw tightened. You do. Charles met his gaze evenly, his expression betraying nothing. I know only that someone believed this was wrong. Leonard let out a cold laugh, the sound empty and bitter. Wrong? His grip on the letter tightened until the paper crumpled. Do you know how many things I've done that the world would call wrong, Charles? Yes, sir, Charles said calmly. And yet none of them ever seemed to trouble you before. The words landed with a force Leonard had not expected. He opened his mouth to retaliate, to shut this down before it could fester, but nothing came. He turned away, pacing toward the window. The mist had begun to lift, revealing the vast stretch of his estate. It was a kingdom built on his terms. Every piece of it bore his signature, his control. And yet, this one thing, this one decision, had been stripped from him. His reflection in the glass looked wrong. The features were the same, but something had shifted. He looked older, weaker. His hand pressed against the cold surface. Where is he? Charles exhaled as if bracing himself. He has been placed in the care of an animal rights foundation. There is considerable media attention. Leonard let out a slow breath. He could feel it now, the world pressing in, waiting for him to react. He had always been untouchable. But this was scandal. How bad? Charles adjusted his cuffs. Front page bad. Leonard's fist struck the glass before he could stop himself. The window shuddered but did not break. Sir, I want him back. Charles' gaze darkened. That may not be possible. Leonard turned, his eyes sharp. It will be possible. I don't care what it takes. Charles studied him carefully. And if he does not want to return? The question sent a jolt through Leonard's chest, sharp and unfamiliar. He forced a scoff. He's a dog, Charles. Charles tilted his head slightly, voice measured. Is he? A tense silence stretched between them. Leonard tore his gaze away first, breathing heavily. He hated this feeling clawing at his chest, this lack of control. Duke was his shadow, his companion, the only constant in a world of shifting loyalties. And yet, when the moment had come, when Leonard had commanded him to go, Duke had obeyed without hesitation. Like he trusted you. The thought was unbearable. He straightened, regaining the edge in his voice. Call my lawyers. Charles did not move. To do what, sir? To fix this. Charles exhaled through his nose. And if it cannot be fixed? Leonard's expression was unreadable. Then I will burn the whole damn thing down. The drive into the city was long, but Leonard felt none of it. The world beyond the car windows blurred. a monotony of rain-slicked streets and faceless figures moving through their insignificant lives. His mind, however, was razor-sharp, honed to a single objective: get Duke back. His lawyers had been useless, drowning in legalities and public pressure. The foundation housing Duke had refused all offers, unmoved by the staggering sums Leonard had placed before them. Even the governor had distanced himself, unwilling to be linked to the scandal. So Leonard did what he had always done. He took matters into his own hands. Charles sat across from him in the back seat of the black town car, his face carefully neutral. But Leonard knew him too well. The man disapproved. He had disapproved of many things over the years, but this time the weight of it was different. "You're making a mistake," Charles said at last, his voice calm, unwavering. Leonard barely glanced at him. "Then it won't be my first." Charles exhaled through his nose. "You don't understand what you're fighting." "I'm fighting for what's mine," Leonard shot back. Charles shook his head slightly. "Number, you're fighting because for the first time, something slipped beyond your reach." Leonard turned his gaze to the window, unwilling to engage further. They arrived at the Foundation's headquarters as dusk settled over the city. The building was smaller than Leonard had expected, modest, made of brick and softened by the warm glow of its interior lights. It was the kind of place built on principle, not profit. How irritating. As they stepped out of the car, Leonard adjusted his cufflinks, ignoring the stares of the volunteers gathered near the entrance. He was used to the scrutiny, the hushed whispers. It no longer touched him. A woman in a navy blue coat approached, her expression steeled against whatever storm Leonard Grayson might bring. "Mr. Grayson," she greeted, "I assume you're here about Duke." Leonard studied her, calculating. She did not fidget, did not shrink beneath his presence. "Yes," he said, his voice clipped. "You have something that belongs to me." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not how we see it." Leonard let out a slow breath, reining in his temper. "You can make this easy, or you can make it expensive. But make no mistake, you will lose." The woman sighed, tilting her head slightly. "Is that what this is to you? A battle? A deal to be negotiated?" Leonard didn't respond. She studied him for a moment longer, then gestured toward the building. "Come with me." He followed, Charles a silent shadow at his side. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the scent of fresh linen and faint traces of antiseptic. The walls were lined with framed photos, rescued animals, success stories, small victories in a world indifferent to suffering. Leonard barely glanced at them. They stopped in front of a glass partition. Beyond it, in a spacious room lined with blankets and cushioned beds, was Duke. Leonard's breath caught. The German shepherd lay curled near a window, his head resting on his paws. But it wasn't the sight of the dog that stopped Leonard's heart. It was the boy. A child, no older than 10, sat cross-legged beside Duke, absently stroking the dog's back as he read aloud from a tattered book. The boy's voice was soft, hesitant, as if unused to speaking freely. But Duke listened, his ears twitching occasionally at the sound. Leonard's stomach twisted. "Who is that?" he asked, his voice low. The woman beside him folded her arms. "His name is Henry. He's been in and out of shelters his entire life. Doesn't talk much to people, but Duke listens." Leonard said nothing. The woman continued, her tone softer now. "Since Duke arrived, Henry hasn't had a single nightmare. He sleeps through the night. He speaks, really speaks, for the first time in months." Leonard's fingers curled at his sides. "You can take him," she said. "We won't stop you. Legally, Duke is still yours." She turned to face him fully. "But you need to ask yourself something, Mr. Grayson. What does ownership mean to you?" Leonard's mouth was dry. Duke had always been his. That was the foundation of everything. Duke had belonged to him, stayed by his side through victories and failures alike. And yet, standing here, staring through the glass, Leonard saw something he had never considered. Duke was happy, not obedient, not waiting for orders, not a relic of a man's need for control, just happy. Leonard felt something shift deep inside him, something old and brittle giving way beneath the weight of a truth he had never wanted to face. Duke was never truly his. He had only been borrowing him. Leonard exhaled slowly. His hands, which had been clenched into fists, relaxed at his sides. Charles watched him carefully, waiting. Finally, Leonard turned from the glass. "Let's go," he said quietly. Charles hesitated. "Sir?" Leonard swallowed. The words felt foreign, unnatural. But they came anyway. "He's where he belongs." Without another word, Leonard walked away. And for the first time in his life, he let something go. The rain had returned by the time Leonard Grayson stepped back into his mansion. It fell in a slow, relentless rhythm, tapping against the tall windows like the ticking of some unseen clock, counting down the moments of his solitude. He moved through the empty corridors without turning on the lights. The house, vast and lifeless, swallowed every sound, stretching shadows long across the marble floors. For the first time, he felt it. The silence was not peaceful. It was empty. He reached his study, barely registering the cold as he shrugged off his coat and sank into the chair by the fire. The flames flickered weakly, throwing erratic patterns against the dark-paneled walls. The untouched whiskey from the night before still sat on the table, a ring of condensation pooling beneath the crystal glass. His hands found the armrests, gripping tightly. He closed his eyes. Duke was gone. Not dead. Not taken. Just gone. His mind replayed the last image of him, curled against that boy, Henry. He saw the soft rise and fall of Duke's breath, the quiet way he had leaned into the child's touch, as if he had finally found something even Leonard could not give him: belonging. Leonard let out a slow breath, his fingers pressing against his temple. All his life he had built, amassed, controlled. Every relationship, every deal, every decision had been a calculation in a long, unshakable formula. But Duke had never been part of that formula. Duke had simply been. And without him, the house felt unbearable. Leonard opened his eyes, staring at the flickering fire. It was smaller now, struggling against the weight of the cold air pressing into the room. It was strange. For years he had lived in this house, surrounded by wealth, by power, by the spoils of a life meticulously designed. But now, he could not recall a single moment of joy within these walls, not a single conversation that mattered, not a single night where the silence had been anything other than suffocating. His thoughts turned back, farther, deeper. He had not always been this man. There had been a time when he laughed freely, when life had felt like something more than a game to be won. He had been a man who had loved, who had dreamed, who had looked at the world with something other than calculation in his eyes. But that man had died long ago, replaced by the one who sat here now, alone. Leonard's gaze dropped to his hands, studying them in the firelight. How many lives had they shaped? How many people had they pushed away? How many things had they destroyed in the name of ambition? Duke had been the last thread connecting him to something real, and he had tried to sever it. A breath shuddered through him. His chest tightened. His throat burned. For a fleeting moment he thought of calling someone. But who? There was no one left. His lawyers were employees. His business partners were opportunists. His lovers had been ghosts, drifting in and out of his life without ever touching him. No friends, no family, nothing. Leonard squeezed his eyes shut. The fire crackled, filling the room with its soft, uneven whispers. And for the first time in his life, Leonard Grayson understood what it was to be truly, utterly alone. A memory resurfaces. The rain outside grew heavier, pounding against the windows. Leonard remained in his chair, unmoving, as his mind slipped into the past. A boy, no older than 10, sat on the floor of a small, cluttered apartment. His hands, smaller than, clutched a ragged old book as he read aloud. His voice was hesitant but determined. Beside him, a German shepherd pup, all paws and oversized ears, listened intently, his tail thumping against the floor. The boy had no father. His mother worked late hours in a diner to keep the lights on. The apartment had been small, but it had been theirs. and Duke had been his. The first thing that had ever been his, not out of obligation or necessity, but simply because love did not ask for permission. Leonard swallowed hard. He had forgotten that boy, forgotten the version of himself who had once believed that love could be unconditional, that life did not have to be a game of conquest, that happiness did not have to be earned, only recognized. The boy had grown up, shaped by a world that told him love was a weakness, that trust was a liability, that the only thing that mattered was power and the ability to hold on to it. That boy had become this man, and in the end, he had lost everything. Leonard let out a slow, shuddering breath. His hands trembled against the armrests. He had to move, had to do something. He rose to his feet abruptly, nearly knocking over the whiskey glass. The room tilted slightly as the weight of exhaustion pressed against him, but he ignored it. Instead, he turned toward the desk, rummaging through a drawer until his fingers closed around something solid. The photograph. The one he had stared at the night before. It was creased now, edges frayed from years of neglect. But the image remained. The boy, the dog, the unshakable bond between them. Leonard clenched his jaw. Then, without another thought, he grabbed his coat and turned toward the door. Charles was waiting in the hall, watching him with quiet curiosity. "Sir?" Leonard hesitated for only a second. Then, "Call the driver." Charles blinked. "Where to, sir?" Leonard exhaled, the words foreign, but inevitable. "To see him." Charles nodded, understanding without the need for explanation. As Leonard stepped out into the storm, the cold rain hit his skin like a baptism. But for the first time in years, he did not care. He had made mistakes. Now he would try to fix them. The rain followed Leonard into the city, lashing against the car's tinted windows as it cut through the darkened streets. The driver said nothing, accustomed to his employer's silence, but Charles, seated beside him, cast an occasional glance in Leonard's direction. Leonard ignored him. His hands were folded in his lap, his grip tight enough to whiten his knuckles. The old photograph sat beside him, the image staring back at him like a ghost. What was he expecting? For Duke to see him and come running? For the weight pressing against his chest to suddenly lift? The car pulled to a stop in front of the foundation's gates. Beyond the rain-streaked windshield, Leonard could see the warm glow of lights inside the main building. It was late, but the facility never truly slept. He hesitated. Charles spoke first. "Would you like me to announce your arrival, sir?" Leonard exhaled, fingers curling. "No." He pushed the door open and stepped into the rain. The water soaked through his coat in seconds, but he barely noticed. His focus was fixed on the entrance ahead. Each step felt heavier than the last. He had faced hostile boardrooms, courtroom battles, men who would tear him apart for his wealth, but none of it had felt as daunting as this. A woman greeted him at the door, the same one as before. Her brows lifted slightly at the sight of him, but she said nothing for a moment, simply studying him. Then, "Mr. Grayson?" Leonard nodded once. "I want to see him." She considered this, then stepped aside. "Follow me." The hallway was quiet, the faint hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. Leonard's heart pounded in his chest. Then they reached the door. Beyond it, Duke. Leonard swallowed hard. The woman turned to him. "I'll leave you alone." He barely nodded as she stepped away, leaving him standing before the glass partition. He took a breath and stepped inside. The room was warm, filled with the scent of fresh linen and the faintest trace of dog fur. Duke lay on a thick cushioned bed in the corner, his body relaxed, eyes half-lidded. Leonard's throat tightened. Slowly, he took another step forward. Duke's ears twitched. Then the dog lifted his head. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then Duke's gaze locked onto Leonard's. And in that instant, Leonard knew. Duke remembered. Leonard opened his mouth, but no words came. The weight in his chest grew unbearable. Finally, he whispered, "Hey, boy." Duke didn't move. Didn't run to him. Didn't wag his tail. Just watched. Waiting. Leonard's heart twisted painfully. He had spent his life believing loyalty was something that could be owned, bought, or commanded. But now, standing here, seeing Duke hesitate, he realized the truth. Loyalty had never been his to take. It had only ever been Duke's to give. And Leonard had broken it. Leonard took a slow, deliberate step forward, but Duke did not move. The German shepherd remained still, watching his former master with an expression Leonard could not read. There was no anger in Duke's gaze, no fear. But there was no trust either. Leonard swallowed hard. The silence between them was unbearable. He had rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times during the drive, but now that he was here, words failed him. What did you say to someone who had once given you their whole heart, only for you to throw it away? His fingers twitched at his sides. The words caught. He tried again. I didn't come to take you back. The rain followed Leonard into the city, lashing against the car's tinted windows as it cut through the darkened streets. The driver said nothing, accustomed to his employer's silence, but Charles, seated beside him, cast an occasional glance in Leonard's direction. Leonard ignored him. His hands were folded in his lap, his grip tight enough to whiten his knuckles. The old photograph sat beside him, the image staring back at him like a ghost. What was he expecting? For Duke to see him and come running? For the weight pressing against his chest to suddenly lift? The car pulled to a stop in front of the foundation's gates. Beyond the rain-streaked windshield, Leonard could see the warm glow of lights inside the main building. It was late, but the facility never truly slept. He hesitated. Charles spoke first. Would you like me to announce your arrival, sir? Leonard exhaled, fingers curling. No. He pushed the door open and stepped into the rain. The water soaked through his coat in seconds, but he barely noticed. His focus was fixed on the entrance ahead. Each step felt heavier than the last. He had faced hostile boardrooms, courtroom battles, men who would tear him apart for his wealth. But none of it had felt as daunting as this. A woman greeted him at the door, the same one as before. Her brows lifted slightly at the sight of him, but she said nothing for a moment, simply studying him. Then, Mr. Grayson. Leonard nodded once. I want to see him. She considered this, then stepped aside. Follow me. The hallway was quiet, the faint hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. Leonard's heart pounded in his chest. Then they reached the door. Beyond it, Duke. Leonard swallowed hard. The woman turned to him. I'll leave you alone. He barely nodded as she stepped away, leaving him standing before the glass partition. He took a breath and stepped inside. The room was warm, filled with the scent of fresh linen and the faintest trace of dog fur. Duke lay on a thick, cushioned bed in the corner, his body relaxed, eyes half-lidded. Leonard's throat tightened. Slowly, he took another step forward. Duke's ears twitched. Then the dog lifted his head. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then Duke's gaze locked onto Leonard's. And in that instant, Leonard knew. Duke remembered. Leonard opened his mouth, but no words came. The weight in his chest grew unbearable. Finally, he whispered, Hey, boy. Duke didn't move, didn't run to him, didn't wag his tail, just watched, waiting. Leonard's heart twisted painfully. He had spent his life believing loyalty was something that could be owned, bought, or commanded. But now, standing here, seeing Duke hesitate, he realized the truth. Loyalty had never been his to take. It had only ever been Duke's to give. And Leonard had broken it. Leonard took a slow, deliberate step forward, but Duke did not move. The German shepherd remained still, watching his former master with an expression Leonard could not read. There was no anger in Duke's gaze, no fear, but there was no trust either. Leonard swallowed hard. The silence between them was unbearable. He had rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times during the drive, but now that he was here, words failed him. What did you say to someone who had once given you their whole heart, only for you to throw it away? His fingers twitched at his sides. The words caught. He tried again. I didn't come to take you back. Duke's ears flicked forward slightly. He was listening. Leonard exhaled, feeling the weight of every year pressing down on him. I just needed to see you. Still, Duke did not move. Leonard let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. I never thought I'd be the kind of man who had to beg for a dog's forgiveness. He looked down at his hands as if they held the answers. I built everything, Duke. I built an empire. I won. And yet... He trailed off, the silence filling in the truth. He had nothing. Duke had been the only living thing in his life that had never wanted anything from him except love. And Leonard had repaid that loyalty with betrayal. Leonard forced himself to meet Duke's gaze again. I made a mistake. The admission felt foreign, bitter on his tongue. He had spent decades refusing to say those words, turning away from anything that resembled regret. But now, stripped of his wealth, his power, his certainty, he saw himself clearly for the first time. He was an old man standing in front of the only soul who had ever truly loved him, asking for something he could not demand. Duke's tail gave a slow, uncertain flick. Not excitement, not rejection, just consideration. Leonard let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Then, footsteps. He turned slightly to see the boy, Henry, standing in the doorway, his small frame hesitant but curious. His fingers curled around the edges of his oversized sweatshirt as he looked between Leonard and Duke. Leonard glanced at Duke. Duke, however, had already shifted. His ears lifted. His tail gave a slow, steady wag. The tension in his body eased as he turned toward the boy, his old familiar warmth returning in an instant. Leonard felt his heart break. Because in that moment, he understood. Duke had moved on, not because he hated Leonard, not because he didn't remember, but because he had found something else, someone who needed him more. Henry stepped closer, uncertainty flickering in his young eyes. He hesitated, then reached out a tentative hand, brushing his fingers through Duke's fur. Duke leaned into the touch, his body language easy, affectionate. Leonard swallowed against the lump in his throat. It had never been about owning Duke. It had been about being worthy of him, and Leonard was no longer sure he was. He took a step back, then another. Duke glanced at him but did not follow. Leonard nodded, more to himself than anyone else. Take care of him, he said quietly, addressing the boy. Henry blinked, looking up at him, startled. Leonard forced a small, sad smile. He deserves that. For a long moment the boy didn't say anything. Then, in a quiet voice, he asked, Are you leaving? Leonard hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, kid, he murmured. I think I am. He turned, walking toward the door. For the first time in his life he did not look back. The rain had stopped by the time Leonard stepped outside, but the world still felt drenched, heavy with the remnants of the storm. He stood beneath the overhang of the foundation's entrance, staring at the pavement slick with water, his breath curling in the cold air. Charles waited by the car, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He had said nothing when Leonard emerged, nor had he pressed him with questions during the ride here. But Leonard knew the silence wouldn't last forever. He finally moved down the steps, his shoes splashing lightly against the wet ground. Charles opened the car door for him, but Leonard hesitated before getting inside. Do you think I did the right thing? He asked. Charles, ever composed, took a moment before responding. That depends on what you mean by right, sir. Leonard exhaled, a humorless chuckle escaping him. I let him go. Charles tilted his head slightly. Did you? Leonard frowned, turning to face him fully. What do you mean? Charles's gaze was steady. You tried to sever the bond between the two of you, sir. And yet, you came back. He gestured subtly toward the foundation behind them. You could have forced them to return him, used your influence, your power, your wealth. But you didn't. That is not letting go, Mr. Grayson. That is accepting. Leonard looked away, his fingers tightening at his sides. Acceptance. The word felt foreign to him, like something softer men allowed themselves to feel. Something he had never made space for in his life. He had been built on taking, winning, bending the world to his will. And yet, here he was. The world had not bent this time. And maybe, for once, that was how it was supposed to be. With a slow breath, Leonard finally ducked into the car, the leather seats cool beneath him. Charles shut the door and walked around to the driver's side, slipping behind the wheel with his usual efficiency. As they pulled away from the foundation, Leonard allowed himself one last look in the rearview mirror. Through the rain-streaked glass, he saw a small figure standing just beyond the doorway. Henry, his hands tucked into the sleeves of his oversized sweater, watching as the car disappeared down the road. And beside him, Duke. The dog sat with perfect stillness, his ears pricked forward, his gaze locked on the departing vehicle. Leonard held the boys and the dog's reflections in the mirror for as long as he could. Then slowly, he let them fade. A life without him. The drive back to the estate was silent. Charles didn't speak, and Leonard didn't offer any words to fill the emptiness. By the time they arrived, the mansion felt even colder than before. The vast hallways stretched endlessly, the chandeliers overhead casting shadows that reached for nothing. For years, this had been his kingdom. Now it felt like a tomb. Leonard loosened his tie as he moved through the halls, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. He reached the study, stepping inside without turning on the lights. The fire had gone out, leaving only the cold embers of what once was. The whiskey glass from the night before still sat on the desk, untouched. The house was exactly as he had left it. And yet, something had changed. Leonard sank into his chair, pressing his hands together, his head bowed slightly. There was no Duke curled at his feet, no soft breathing filling the silence, no watchful eyes gazing up at him with unquestioning loyalty. For the first time, Leonard truly understood what he had lost. Duke had not been just a dog. He had been the last piece of the boy Leonard used to be. And now, that boy was gone. Leonard closed his eyes, the weight of the years pressing down on him, suffocating. For so long, he had convinced himself that power was enough, that wealth, control, dominance, these things were the markers of a life well lived. But as he sat in the darkness of his empire, surrounded by riches and ruins alike, Leonard Grayson finally saw the truth. He had built a fortress of stone and steel, and in doing so, he had made sure that no one, not even himself, could ever find their way inside. A shuddering breath escaped him. For the first time in years, Leonard felt the sting of something real, regret. And for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to feel it. The storm had long since passed, but Leonard Grayson's world remained drenched in its aftermath. He sat in his study for what felt like hours, unmoving. The fire had burned out, the whiskey had turned bitter, and the weight in his chest refused to lift. His mind felt empty and restless all at once, a battlefield of memories and silence. Duke was gone. Not taken, not lost, but given. And now, for the first time in his life, Leonard found himself asking the one question he had never allowed. What now? He had spent a lifetime believing in control, shaping the world to his will, forcing outcomes to align with his vision. And yet in this one moment, he was faced with something he could not manipulate. An empty house, a quiet life, a future he had not planned for. The past could not be rewritten, but the future. Leonard inhaled slowly. Then, for the first time in years, he reached for the telephone. He dialed a number he had not used in over a decade. The line rang twice before a tired voice answered. Leonard? The sound of his younger brother's voice settled over him like a weight, heavy and unfamiliar. It's me, Leonard said quietly. He exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. I don't know why I called. There was a pause on the other end. Then, You're lying, his brother said, voice unreadable. But I'll wait. Leonard swallowed hard. The last time they had spoken, the conversation had ended in slammed doors and lawyers. Years of resentment had widened the chasm between them until it had become easier to leave it untouched, like an old wound that never fully healed. Leonard had walked away from everything: family, love, humanity. But Duke had never walked away from him. And now he was realizing, too late, that the things that mattered were never won, only earned. His grip on the phone tightened. "I let him go," Leonard admitted at last. "Duke, I let him go." A silence followed, but it wasn't the kind that cut. It was the kind that held. "I heard," his brother said finally. "It was in the news." Leonard scoffed softly. "Of course." Another pause, then. "I didn't think you'd do it." "Neither did I." More silence. Then his brother's voice softened. "Are you okay?" Leonard's throat tightened. The question was simple, almost too simple. But it unraveled something inside him. For the first time in decades, he had no answer. "I don't know," he admitted, and the words felt heavier than any deal he had ever signed, any fortune he had ever amassed. His brother was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Come home." Leonard closed his eyes. Home. It was a word that had lost its meaning long ago. His mansion had never been home. His empire had never been home. And yet for the first time the idea of home didn't seem so distant. He exhaled shakily. "I don't know how." His brother's voice was steady. "You don't have to." Leonard opened his eyes. The fire had died, but the embers still glowed. Faint, but not gone. A new beginning. 2 weeks later, Leonard stood outside the foundation's gates again. He wasn't there to take Duke back. That much he knew. He was simply there to see, to understand, to accept. Through the glass windows, he could see Duke curled beside Henry, the boy's small hands buried in the dog's fur as they slept. It was peaceful. They were peaceful. Leonard had never been a religious man, but standing there, he felt something like absolution. He would never undo the past, but perhaps for the first time he was willing to learn from it. With a final glance, Leonard turned and walked away. Not back to the mansion. Not back to the life he had built on sand. But forward. Into whatever came next. Leonard Grayson spent a lifetime believing power and wealth could shield him from regret. But in the end, it wasn't money or influence that defined him. It was the choice to let go, to accept, and to finally see what had been in front of him all along. How often do we hold on to things believing they belong to us, when in reality they were never ours to keep? Sometimes, true strength is found in surrender. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in the power of change, subscribe for more stories that challenge the heart.